There are in any given year between maybe 6 and 15 major weapons deals in the world, each of which is likely to be worth tens of billions of dollars to the companies involved and to the countries involved. So vast amounts of money on a very small number of transactions. Allied with that is that the decisions about what equipment to buy and who to buy it from are taken by a remarkably small number of people. So on the deal that I looked into as a member of Parliament, there were 6 ministers who made every decision about what to buy and who to buy it from. And then this very small circle is hidden behind the veil of national security imposed secrecy. So nothing that the company does, nothing that the ministers do, is going to find its way into the public domain until well after the transaction has taken place. And then still, the amount of information that is made public is minuscule. I argue that this corruption, as well as the efforts to conceal it, undermine the rule of law, not just in buying countries, but as much in selling countries. They distort the market and pollute the business environment, the political process, and the functioning of the state. I experienced this firsthand. I had joined the ANC in my late teens in South Africa, in townships outside Cape Town, and was a very young member of Parliament, one of not many people in the ANC who in 1994, at the point of our liberation from apartheid, had an academic background in economics and finance. I found myself having chaired the subcommittee in Parliament that drafted all of the public financial management legislation as the ranking ANC member on the main financial oversight committee, a committee called the Public Accounts Committee in Westminster Systems of Government. A report came to our committee about an arms deal undertaken by our extremely young democracy, a democracy that faced no enemies, a democracy that faced no traditional, narrowly defined security threat. We decided to spend $10 billion on weapons. Weapons we didn't use, and weapons we have barely used until today. Why would we do that? $300 million of bribes is why we did it. Senior politicians, including some of the 6 people who made the decisions, the head of the National Defense Force, the head of procurement in the National Defense Force, other state officials, senior executives at the state arms company, all the beneficiaries of this corruption. This was at a time when 6 million South Africans were living with HIV or AIDS, where over 2 million South Africans had no roof over their head. At a time like today, where South Africa suffers from a formal unemployment rate of almost 30%. But, according to our then President, Thabo Mbeki, Nelson Mandela's successor, we could not afford the fiscal resources to provide antiretroviral medication for those people living with AIDS who couldn't afford private health care. South Africa's current president, Jacob Zuma, faced 783 counts of corruption, fraud, and racketeering in relation to the deal. The charges were dropped by an acting head of prosecutions in the country a few weeks before Zuma was elected president. A few weeks after the election, that same person was made a High Court judge. It was the moment at which the ANC, a remarkable, extraordinary liberation movement that had counted Chief Albert Luthuli, the first African recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize, amongst its leaders, that had seen Oliver Tambo lead the organization, Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela. That organization, since that point, has been engulfed in corruption, as has the South African state at every level. These leaders of our liberation struggle were prepared to undermine the institutions of our democracy that we had fought so long to bring about in order to hide the corruption in this deal. So when I try to investigate it, to cut a very long story short, I was threatened with removal from Parliament. And the night before I was to be removed from Parliament, I resigned. My first book after the party dealt with that deal and its consequences. Of the 24 jet trainers bought from the British company BAE Systems, which paid £115 million of bribes, 11 have left the ground. Of the 26 jet fighters bought from the Swedish company Saab in partnership with BAE, 14 have never left the ground because we can't afford to fuel them, to train the pilots to fly them, and because we have absolutely no need of them. But far worse than that is the reality, according to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, that in the 5 years following that arms deal, because of the policy choice that was made, 362,000 South Africans, a conservative estimate, died avoidable deaths from HIV or AIDS. 52,000 babies every year were born HIV positive because we would rather have rusting Gripen jet fighters than provide mother-to-child transmission treatment. And what of the companies who corrupted this young, naive democracy? BAE Systems, the pride and joy of British manufacturing. Tony Blair himself made 3 visits to South Africa to persuade our government to buy the jets that our Air Force said they would only take if forced to do so by the politicians, and which were 2.5 times more expensive than the jets the Air Force actually wanted. The royal family, headed by the Queen, who we found out 2 days ago, stashes at least £10 million in offshore secrecy jurisdictions, sailed the then royal yacht Britannia to Cape Town Harbor and invited those 6 ministers to dinner to persuade them of the value of these planes. Or maybe to explain to them what £115 million look like. The United Kingdom's Serious Fraud Office investigated BAE on that and 8 other deals where they were paying bribes of similar proportions at virtually the same time, all of those deals having been personally championed by Prime Minister Tony Blair. The Serious Fraud Office settled with BAE, who had to admit to 1 count of accounting irregularities in the smallest deal, fined £500,000 on contracts that they made billions of pounds of profit in, and the main law enforcement agent of the British government agreed not to allege corruption against that company or any of its agents in any of those deals or in any related deals, effectively closing down investigations across all 8 of those countries.